Breaking news tonight.
Breaking news.
Huge breaking news tonight. And I can't even believe I'm going to tell you what I'm about to tell you.
Lately, have you felt exhausted just by keeping up with the news? And that no matter how many people protest, donate, or vote, bad stuff keeps happening without any clear way to prevent it?
13 mass shootings.
Unidentified objects shot down by fighter jets.
Overturned Roe v. Wade.
You can't help but feel overwhelmed, fatigued, and hopeless. And you start to doubt whether you can do anything about the endless tide of news alerts popping up on your phone.
This is America's disease.
Doesn't this make you want to drop out of current events altogether? Well, you're not alone. Or even that unique. A 2022 poll estimated that only 13% of Americans believe their country is headed in the right direction. This widespread feeling of helplessness, this isn't a glitch in the American system. In fact, it's a feature.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
Let's start with some basics. While the United States government is technically a republic, it's specifically a democratic republic, and it's designed to act as a representative democracy. And this is how representative democracy works. A group of human beings, we'll call them citizens, gather to decide which of their fellow citizens should have the power to make laws and build programs that can benefit them. Whoever gets the most votes from their peers gets the power to do things others can't. We'll call this select group the government. The government has a lot of power to make a lot of decisions. Maybe they build bridges. Maybe they destroy bridges. Maybe they fund care centers for the needy elderly. Maybe they destroy care centers for the needy elderly. These measures add up to what we call their policy. Then, after an agreed upon period of time, these same citizens come together to either re-elect members of their government or vote them out, basing their decision on the policies the government enacted. Basically, the American public is supposed to act as the government's boss, which makes sense, seeing as our taxes go towards their pay. Let's say citizen number 62 wants to re-elect council member number 12, because they built a subway that cuts their daily commute time in half, allowing them to work more shifts making sandwiches for customers. Let's say citizen number 43 wants to vote out their local dog catcher, because he decided to replace all the adoption centers for puppies and kittens with phantom fireworks stores. This relationship between the government, what the government does while in power, and the ability of its citizens to vote accordingly is the policy feedback loop. And it's the core way the public holds the government accountable for anything they do in office. This sounds like democracy, right? But lately, the policy feedback loop that our entire system relies on is weakening, and that's a problem. If a powerful government doesn't have to worry about how its voters will react to what they're doing in office, they can just do whatever they want. And that has led to some pretty disastrous consequences in the past.
Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Now, how did this happen? These issues have been worsening for a long time, and there are so many different layers and dynamics to our modern political system that you can point to. But I think it's best summed up by pointing to three major culprits of this loop's decline. 1, the way our government is structured. 2, how us voters get the information we use to elect our government. And 3, how money has influenced both of these systems. Let's start with the problems within the federal government itself.
We've traced the call. It's coming from inside the house.
Thanks to the Founding Fathers, who ratified the Constitution in 1788, as well as a bunch of other white dudes who have been changing it ever since, the way America elects its members of government is so confusing and convoluted that it often prevents whoever got the most votes from being elected into power in the first place. One of the most blatant examples of this is the Electoral College, which decides the President of the United States, one of the most powerful offices in the world, not by who got the most votes, but by which states they got those votes in. Each state is given a certain number of electoral votes depending on the state's population, and the candidate that gets 270 or more electoral votes is elected president. Side note, the only reason this exists in the first place is because of slavery, which isn't great. The Electoral College has led to the US recently having 2 presidents, for a combined 12 years, who lost the popular vote, meaning that for most of the century we are currently living in, the President of the United States got elected after getting fewer votes than their opponents. This does not sound like democracy as we understand it.
The votes that happen to be cast in battleground states, the half a dozen states that decide elections, clearly count much more than votes in safe Republican or safe Democratic states.
A Republican nominee for president doesn't have to worry about what a voter from California thinks, since that state is so Democratic they're not going to get those electoral votes anyways. And similarly, a Democratic nominee for president doesn't have to worry about what a voter from rural Kentucky thinks, because that state is so red they're not going to get those votes. This itself is a huge blow to the relationship between government and those they serve. Because when these presidents have the chance to make major decisions in office, whether that's taking away healthcare from the poor or starting a war, they only have to worry about certain voters in certain states, depending on what works best for their electoral college strategy. The electoral college alone has incentivized each side to dig in further, worsening polarization that has infected our entire lawmaking process. This has led to long-term changes within all three branches of our federal government that has affected policy in meaningful ways. One example of this happened in June of 2022, with the court case of Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization, which had to do with whether to uphold a Mississippi law that banned the person from getting an abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land and one of the three main branches of our federal government.
Supreme Court this morning announced it's taking up a major abortion case. The ripple effects, though, could reach far beyond this one case and far beyond that one state.
Since this case had to do with the right to have an abortion, a landmark ruling from the 1970s came under the spotlight for the court's analysis. Roe v. Wade was a case the Supreme Court reviewed in 1973, where it ruled that a person's right to have an abortion was covered under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, as part of the right to privacy. Now, thanks to Dobbs v. Jackson, the court had the opportunity to uphold Roe v. Wade, weaken it, or even overturn it.
The question is, can the states ban abortion before viability without violating the Constitution?
So how did the actual public feel about it? A poll conducted in May of 2022 showed that 64% of Americans did not want Roe to be overturned. But the Supreme Court's views on abortion didn't line up with what a majority of Americans believed. And that's thanks to the Electoral College, and the presidents it brought into power. The 2022 court hearing this case had 5 out of its 9 judges nominated by a president who lost the popular vote. This effectively created a 6-3 conservative majority, and that majority decided to completely overturn Roe v. Wade and end the federal protection of the right to have an abortion. This wasn't surprising, as that's been a goal among American conservatives for the past 50 years. The majority of voting Americans believe they have the right to reproductive care. For many, this is a deeply held personal belief. Yet this particular iteration of the Supreme Court, nominated mostly by presidents who got fewer votes than their opponent, decided that the public's beliefs shouldn't be reflected in federal policy, and instead used their unelected seats of power to change the world in their image. Since the Supreme Court doesn't have a military, or the ability to raise any money, the most powerful weapon they have is the public's trust.
Do you have confidence in the Supreme Court? 40% only said they have confidence. A majority, 56%, said no. That is almost a perfect flip, Judy, from 4 years ago, July of 2018.
I think a larger group of people are saying, really, guys? The only reason this changed was because of intervening presidential elections that changed the makeup of the court. You're no different than Congress or a state legislature when you get right to it. And that's a powerful criticism of a court, of an institution that's supposed to be kind of above politics. It's going to be a challenging couple of years for the court to make sure that people continue to give them the respect they traditionally have received.
And this self-imposed crisis would most likely have never happened, simply had the person who got the most votes became president and confirmed their preferred judges. Let's look at a second example of how the government's own rules get in the way of what its voters actually want, this time with the legislative branch. Now, when we think of anti-democratic norms in our lawmaking branch, the Senate's filibuster immediately comes to mind, since it requires a supermajority of 60 senators voting yes on a bill for it to pass, instead of just a simple majority of 51. Now, there are a ton of other great videos that go into detail about the filibuster and its impacts on our government and our democracy. I encourage you to watch those if you want. But the example I'm about to give shows how even if the filibuster is avoided, the makeup of the Senate itself prevents the majority from getting their say. In December of 2021, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats were attempting to pass their huge social infrastructure bill, deemed Build Back Better, into law. And it was popular. Build Back Better, which included policies to fight climate change and lower the price of healthcare, had the support from 61% of American voters in the same month it was making its way through Congress. Yet another strong majority, similar to the support of Roe v. Wade.
It is probably the most consequential bill since the 1960s.
These things
are popular.
It's remarkable for a man who has spent nearly half a century in public office how much of his legacy comes down to this moment.
And since it was technically considered a government spending bill, it only needed 51 senators to pass. It's this loophole called the Byrd Rule. Look that up if you want. When the bill was being debated, the Senate was perfectly divided between 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans, with Vice President Kamala Harris being the tiebreaker for the former. Now, under this composition, the Senate didn't actually reflect how Americans voted. Once again, we have the Constitution to thank for this. Due to large, condensed clusters of Democratic cities in America, NPR calculated that in 2021, Senate Democrats represented about 40 million more voters than Senate Republicans. So why was the 2021 Senate divided at 50-50? Because the framers of the Constitution decided to make up the Senate in a way where every state has 2 senators, no matter their population. This means that Wyoming, a state with a total population of over 579,000 people, has the same amount of influence in the Senate as California, a state with over 39 million people. Going by this calculation, if the Senate seats would have been distributed directly in proportion to the populations they represented, Democrats would have held a 12-seat majority in 2021, giving them plenty of room to win enough votes to pass the bill, even if a few of their party members wouldn't go their way. But that's not the world we live in. In reality, a single Democrat voting no would derail the entire process. And, well,
I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't.
West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat, ended up rejecting the bill, and it failed to even be put to a vote in Congress. Just like that, a huge cornerstone of the president's agenda, which had a strong majority of public support, was defeated.
This is a terrible political outcome, one of the worst I think we've seen for a first-year president ever.
While that specific take might be a bit hyperbolic, this still had a huge impact on public policy that affected hundreds of millions of people. It's becoming harder to deny that the key to gaining power in American politics is to approach campaigning like a competitive sport. And that's thanks to us following over 250-year-old principles that are easy to manipulate. But governing isn't a sport. It's supposed to be a public service that benefits the greater good. And that service is getting undermined more and more every day. Now, the second major cause of the policy feedback loop's decline comes in the way that we as voters receive our information to help elect our leaders. This is commonly known as just the media. And the media is in pretty dubious territory. Steve Bannon, a former senior advisor to President Trump and criminal convict, told author Michael Lewis in 2018 that his strategy for winning elections was to use the media to, quote, flood the zone with shit and distract people from more significant issues at play that could hurt support for his candidates. Nowadays, there's a lot of shit. News articles, tweets of news articles, TikToks of news articles, so many takes of those news articles. Keeping up with current events is exhausting, and so people tune out of the news entirely. And that's understandable, especially in an age where, instead of watching Senator Sinema give yet another press conference explaining her support for the filibuster, you can instead take edibles and watch baby censored videos on YouTube. Why these distractions can be harmful is that when people aren't well informed of what their elected officials are doing, the less prepared they are when going to the ballot box to vote. For example, do you remember when that bombshell story came out about how Ginny Thomas, wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, texted multiple officials in the Trump administration urging them to overturn the 2020 presidential election?
This is a spouse of a Supreme Court justice communicating with the executive branch.
Do not concede, Ginny Thomas wrote. It takes time for the army who is gathering for his back.
If you forgot about it, it might be due in part to it being overshadowed that same week by another incident.
Oh, wow! Will Smith just smacked the shit out of me.
While distracting the public from a major story about a presidential election is itself an issue, the media got caught up in the 2020 presidential campaign in an even more harmful way.
CNN projects Joseph R. Biden Jr. is elected the 46th president of the United States.
When Joe Biden was called by multiple reputable outlets as the winner of the 2020 election, it signaled what would usually be an end of the competition for the job. But that wasn't the case this time around.
This is a fraud on the American public. Frankly, we did win this election.
After months of sowing doubts about the integrity of the voting process, incumbent President Donald Trump, who was defeated in the election, began peddling the lie that he in fact won, and it was stolen from him by Democrats via voting by mail, despite a mountain of judicial cases disproving his claim. Then it took a more volatile turn when misinformation then spread via social media. Facebook groups went crazy, with over 650,000 posts questioning the legitimacy of the election results, and the content became increasingly violent in tone. Through these Facebook groups, and encrypted messaging services like Signal, believers of Trump's lies gathered virtually and in person to start to plot ways to try and actually overturn the election results.
We will not be silenced!
This all came to a head on January 6, 2021, when hundreds of rioters stormed the US Capitol the day Congress was slated to certify the presidential election results, leading to 7 deaths. While the January 6th insurrection was a disturbing attack in itself, its true danger lies in what it implies for the future. Despite his peddling of lies about the election, including a speech where he urged his supporters to specifically march on the Capitol,
We will never give up, we will never concede.
the vast majority of elected Republicans refused to punish Donald Trump for his actions. Most Republicans in the House of Representatives even voted to overturn the election just hours after their own Capitol was under siege. Not to mention that Fox News itself, the most watched news station in the country, has promoted these figures and their lies about our election process.
There's clearly voter fraud all over the country.
We need to find out exactly what happened in this election. And there are questions.
Now, what does this naturally lead to? A large part of our country being misled. A YouGov poll released in June of 2022 showed that 70% of self-identified Republicans believed the 2020 election was stolen, and Republican lawmakers quickly took advantage of this belief.
More than 40 states now moving to set new limits on voting under the guise of election security, despite no credible evidence of widespread election fraud.
Jim Crow in a suit and tie.
Governments in several states have since enacted sweeping voting laws to make it more difficult for likely Democratic voters to have their votes counted.
Most of these measures are aimed at the early vote and the mail-in vote, when you look at this state, broke heavily for Democrats in November and January.
There's also been an emergence of election deniers themselves running for public office, setting up a more dangerous scenario for any future attempts to overturn an election. As there will be more bad actors inside the vote counting itself, they could refuse to certify the results of any election a Democrat wins.
Trump almost got away with it. The only reason the coup did not work is that there were enough people in key positions of power that wouldn't go along with it.
And this was all spawned by voter fraud claims that were widely debunked, or what Trump's own attorney general called bullshit. If our government systematically takes away the power of voting from specific populations, or if we can't even trust the vote counters themselves to accurately count the votes that are submitted, how can we ever expect to have a safe and legitimate election in this country again? Additionally, why do public leaders ever feel accountable to their constituents if they can count on disinformation and election manipulation to keep them in power regardless of what they do? And that leads us to our third major culprit, which is a sinister background to everything we've covered so far: the influence of money.
It's all about the money.
Now, I feel the need to add a disclaimer that I've worked in both politics and news, and it's been my experience that the vast majority of people who work in these areas are genuinely well-meaning, and they want their work to have a positive impact. So the following criticisms aren't directed at them individually, but instead at the larger structures they operate within, which they don't have much power to change, no matter their good intentions. Okay, disclaimer done. Money affecting the news and political campaigns has been an issue since the beginning of politics in the United States. But what tipped the scale recently is the Supreme Court's 2010 ruling on Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. The outcome of Citizens United allowed corporations and other outside groups to spend unlimited money on political elections, arguing that political spending counted as, quote, free speech under the First Amendment, as long as they're not formally part of any political campaign. This ruling changed our elections in dramatic ways. Since the Supreme Court's decision in 2010, there has been a massive increase in outside spending on campaigns, and the power of corporate donors to influence political outcomes through super political action committees, or super PACs, where they can pour in money from undisclosed sources into campaigns under the name of a registered nonprofit.
Saying that it's going to operate independently frees it from legal contribution limits and legal spending limits, so that it can raise as much as it wants to from any American donor or business and spend as much as it wants to.
A report by the Brennan Center 5 years after the ruling concluded that a small amount of wealthy Americans now wield, quote, more power than at any time since Watergate, while many of the rest seem to be disengaging from politics.
So few people able to outweigh the influence of 7 million small donors is a really distressing thing in a democracy.
So that's how money has flooded our elections. Now when it comes to the media, their very survival is dependent on how much profit they rake in. And how do they make that profit? By getting the most people possible to engage with what they're putting out. News channels need people to watch their breaking news updates. Websites need people to click on their articles. Social media companies need you to hit a react button on everything that you see. This profit incentive has been the case for centuries. But like with Citizens United, a recent development, this time called the internet, has escalated it to a whole new level.
The news is breaking, I've got it now.
There's now an incomprehensible amount of content these outlets need to compete with. So if they want any chance to stand out from the crowd, they need to create sensational material to draw eyeballs in their direction.
Internet makes lots of money, so give us some of that money. Give us internet money.
A glaring example of this happened in the 2016 presidential election. A tracking firm calculated that in early 2016, Donald Trump had earned almost $2 billion in free media coverage, simply from news organizations and media outlets covering him relentlessly. This was more than Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio combined. Why was this the case? Because he'd constantly say and do things they knew would help their ratings and numbers.
You gotta see this guy. I don't know what I said. Look at my African American over here. Look at him.
Giving a candidate billions of dollars of free publicity just because of their viral potential is what happens when a media ecosystem isn't motivated to keep its consumers informed about current events in any substantial way, as that usually doesn't get them the money they need from advertisers.
We need higher ratings. How do we get them? Juicier stories.
Instead of briefing you on, say, the major issues in your local city election, they'd much rather entice you with headlines about Hunter Biden's dick pics, or
The Trojan Horse is a Black History AP high school class.
I had a nice lunch at Taco Bell, cost me about $28.
The green M&M, you will notice, is no longer wearing sexy boots.
So, if we zoom back out and look at all three causes the policy feedback loop's decline, it's pretty clear that this disconnect between citizens and their leaders is deeply woven in our American system. So the policy feedback loop is dying, but why should we care? While it may not seem like what anything our federal government does affects our everyday lives, the government not being held accountable for what they do is a slippery slope. If those in charge don't care about the feelings of their voters, they feel free to do whatever they please. And historically, that usually means consolidating their own power and wealth, at the expense of the very people they're supposed to serve. A current example of this is Russia's Vladimir Putin, who has effectively been in power since 2000. While in office, Putin has used the same three tactics we've covered to hold a vice grip on what is supposed to be a democracy. When it comes to the structure of Russia's government, he's used the weaknesses in Russia's young constitution to modify the rules and give himself enough terms as president to keep him in power for decades, as opposing to serving only 2 6-year terms.
Russia is looking forward to many years ahead of Vladimir Putin in charge.
Secondly, he's captured Russia's information system by jailing journalists and political opponents he finds threatening, as well as taking a great effort to control media outlets.
Все поняли, что Россия великая держава. Это самое главное. Все.
In today's Russia, it's getting increasingly difficult to question authorities or to publish inconvenient truths.
And of course, he's used his hold on the country to increase the size of his own wallet and reward government contracts to close friends and family. This gives him even more power to control the country's major industries, with his oligarch buddies having his back.
Everything depends on Putin.
Were these oligarchs effectively just paying tribute to Vladimir Putin?
I think this is exactly what they thought.
So what has he done with this power? He's used it to throw Russia into a war in Ukraine that has cost the lives of thousands of his own troops, launching an unprovoked invasion on an independent country that basically the entire world disagrees with, is what someone does when they don't feel accountable for what their citizens want them to do.
Putin behaves like a czar.
And he's behaving irrationally because he's fallen into what I call the dictator trap, which is the fact that to stay in power, dictators do things that ultimately and eventually cause their downfall because they construct fake realities, and then they make mistakes based on their belief in those fake realities.
Unchecked autocrats causing havoc on their own people is something that's happened all throughout history in all parts of the globe. And it can happen here too. I mean, it almost did not too long ago.
We're seeing protesters overcome the police.
The United States of America prides itself on the ideal of democracy it provided to the rest of the world in the 18th century and beyond. But those ideals have not played out as well in reality. In just the last generation, our system has allowed one president, not elected by the majority of voters, to invade a Middle Eastern country with disastrous consequences. And then, not even 20 years later, allowed yet another president, who lost the popular vote, the power to transform the Supreme Court to make decisions that go against the beliefs of the voters they're supposed to serve. While these challenges to true democracy are system-wide and require structural change to improve, the first step to meaningful progress is to elect leaders who will challenge these abuses of power. And I know that sounds really tiring, as that's all we hear from politicians no matter what happens. But it's true. A study in 2019 concluded that voter impact on public policy is all about turnout level. It claims that for voters to have any effect on the government's policy, quote, there has to be a sufficiently high turnout level, and they have to succeed in delivering a parliamentary majority to the party they prefer. Only if all these conditions are met can they realistically expect to have an effect on government policy. That means voting in your local elections, particularly for candidates who support taking money out of politics, so our leaders have the power to prevent any further deterioration of our democracy. We can also support our local news outlets to give us accurate, relevant information, instead of letting the profit incentive completely take over most of the news available to us. If we all care enough, we actually can make our government and our world a better place for us to live. But if we don't have a functioning democracy where we can get our say, that blocks out everything else we want to achieve.
The simple use of majority voting that we use in democracies for decision making allows us to be correct more often than we are wrong. Democracies are wealthier. They have higher level of human development. Citizens of democracies are happier and healthier.
I mean, think about it. Do we really want a country where, hypothetically, Elon Musk can win his campaign for governor of Texas, even though he was caught on camera pouring champagne on the local homeless population? Or do you want a government where, hypothetically, President Tucker Carlson can make not standing during the national anthem punishable by death, since he doesn't have to get the most votes to stay in power? I'm not sure we do. And luckily, we still have that choice. For now. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more takes and history from yours truly. Oh wait.